Welcome back to Inclusion Dialogue this week. Judy, it's such a pleasure to have you on the podcast. You are such a regular visitor to Ireland and to Trinity College, but I really have been planning and hoping that you'd agree to come on the show and tell us about your work and tell us about your own research area and your views on inclusive education. So thanks a million for being here. Do you mind if I start the interview, which I do with a lot of my interviewees, because I'm just quite curious about it, is just how did you end up working in this field of inclusive education, and maybe describe your early career to us?
Thanks, Jan, and it's such a pleasure to be on this podcast with you. And thank you for the invitation and for being able to have this opportunity to share with you and with others. So, yes, that's a good place to start. I trained first of all as a speech and hearing therapist in at the University of Cape Town, and then I worked in a rural area of South Africa in the early to late 80s, when it was a very volatile place and really subject to a lot of segregation. And in fact, it was a time of conflict as well. And working in a rural hospital, it soon became clear to me that just working on speech therapy and on how to address certain specific needs, it wasn't really reaching the places where children with disabilities needed to go and wasn't having the potential to give them a better quality of life. So that really moved me into, well, education. What kind of education were they getting? And then, of course, we learned that most of them were just staying at home and weren't going to school or were otherwise being sent to very distant special schools. So that's where I began to really feel that we needed that inclusion was the way to go. And we actually worked in the field of early childhood development and inclusion. So really starting at the beginning. So that was the beginning of the route. But then while I was there, I had 3 children while I was living there. And my youngest turned out to have Down syndrome. And going through the experience with him as a parent, I became very involved with the parent movement in South Africa, largely focused with Down syndrome South Africa as a leader. And so that kind of was more of an activist role. And then subsequently, I moved more into a teacher education role around inclusive education and academic and research. So I think I've looked at the issues from many different sides and
Yeah.
still find it endlessly fascinating. So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And it's great that you have a kind of a personal interest and story behind it, which I think a lot of our contributors have had over the years. It's something that we've noted on the podcast. For listeners, that you're our first South African speaker. So for those who don't know the system in South Africa, could you give an overview? It's quite difficult. I know these systems are quite complicated, but could you give an overview of what the kind of education system is like broadly, and where special education fits in with that?
Well, I think that I would do really by looking at the phases that we've been through in South Africa, and that would be moving from an apartheid government to a democratic government, and then looking at where we are now as a more mature democracy. So under the apartheid government, and in those days, then education was delivered in a range of education departments. There were very many of them, and they were according to ethnic grouping. So I always forget the number, something like 12 or 13 education departments in one country. And the intention of the curriculum delivered in those education departments was to create very different types of citizens. So they were geared very much to fit into the role that was envisaged for the different race groups in the apartheid state. So once the democratic era dawned, there was a big challenge, and that was, how do you integrate all these departments? And the issues around inclusion and around special educational needs and disability featured in that discussion as quite prominently. So I think that was an advantage. It wasn't an issue right from the beginning. That led into a process of developing an inclusive education policy in South Africa, with quite a focus on redress for past disadvantage and on building equity. So I think we came at inclusive education from very much a human rights perspective and
Okay.
redress and equity on the one hand. But on the other hand, there still was the special education sector that had been in existence for white children and for some children of color, specifically more in the areas of sensory disability. So there was
Right.
also the special education. So we came together in this inclusive education policy, which had a strong human rights redress and equity element, but it also had the special education element. And both are present in that early policy. So that's what we ended up working with in the up until now, the Education White Paper 6.
So we're talking about the early 90s to now. So what did provision look like over those decades? What has provision looked
Yeah.
like? So what kind
Yeah.
of child with the disability in school access?
So, in the early 90s, that would have been a large degree of exclusion. A lot of children with disabilities would have been at home without any schooling whatsoever, especially if they
Right.
were Black and poor.
Yeah.
And then uh, children who were more privileged would be in special schools. Um, and there were also special classes at that stage for mainly in the white education system. Which was a separate education system. So, with the advent of the inclusive education policy, which was built up on the whole educational reform to move from that 13 departments into one, so it was built into that process. So then it became a system-wide issue. Special education, which had been provided for a very small group, and bringing in many children who'd been excluded from the system. So those were kind of the issues that we're facing. And then there was also the issue of poor teacher education. There were the education of Black teachers had been sorely neglected, and many had only like a matric, a school leaving certificate with 1 or 2 years. So that was the situation that the Education White Paper 6, the Inclusive Education Policy, was designed to address. So the premise of that policy became that there are many barriers to learning, there are many barriers to education, of which disability is only one. So while taking that approach, which seems to be a very broad approach to education, it also had the special education elements still there, which led to this kind of contradiction in terms of inclusive at one level, but special educational thinking and discourse at another level. So that is what we've been working with, that kind of contradiction, and that's where the policy development and the and I have to say, I think we've done a lot in South Africa. There's been a lot done. There's been really a growth and understanding of inclusive education, of the need for education, of people with disabilities, and uh, it's really we've made a lot of progress, but of course it's never enough. And we're still now saying, but are we really getting? I think we've done a lot of access. There's been a lot of access, but the participation and the success and the quality of education are what we need to deal with now. Yeah.
Yes. So your white paper 6, I think, if I'm correct, parallels a little bit our Epson paper or Epson legislation here in Ireland. So the white paper 6 is the early 2000s, and you've explained really nicely how it's
2001.
coming from a human rights perspective, and it sounds like quite a progressive interpretation of inclusive education, where the emphasis isn't solely on disability and kind of other barriers to learning. I know that there's quite a strong special school sector in South Africa as well. Do you want to talk about that a little?
Yes, so the kind of analysis that we've looked at in terms of that when we've been looking at the reviewing of the Education White Paper 6, it's sort of like it's twofold. The one is from the old system, where special schools were established as like state of the art for the privileged white population, and maintaining that area and maintaining the the whole ethos of special education became very important for special schools. So that was on the one hand. And on the other hand, there was also the kind of idea that if that is what the privileged population had before, then everybody should have access. So there should be special schools for all. So instead of saying inclusion for all, there should be special schools for all. So I think that was also another force for special schools. So I think those are but there also are the other thing that I think is supporting it is the inadequate response in mainstream schools. And I think that's really the issue that's keeping them growing, keeping special schools growing, and keeping that whole sector growing where we are today. Because mainstream schools are not considered a sufficiently viable option for children with disabilities, but they are, I think, becoming more accommodating to other forms of diversity. So I think that, regular schools are becoming more accommodating of other forms of diversity. So I think that that there has been progress in that sense, but in terms of disability, I think the special schools have not really changed considerably in that
So
context.
there's would you call it a pull factor into special schools for parents and
Yes,
children?
yes, yeah,
Yeah.
yes, yeah. I think there
Um,
is a push
I have
factor
a
out of mainstream.
out. Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah.
I have quite an interest in, and I know we've talked about this, Judy. I've interest in funding and the way the funding is allocated in South Africa. Does the funding influence provision? Does it influence decision making like that as well?
Absolutely, and it's a critical issue that has been identified. So the funding for what would be called special educational needs broadly would really go into special schools, and to distribute that funding into regular schools is um, it's just not really possible within the current budgeting system. So that's going to be a transformation that has to be made, and it has a lot of difficult and legal implications. It has to be accompanied by a policy that says that it needs to be done like that. There are all sorts of things that need to be happened, but I think the funding bit is really crucial. The funding needs
Yeah.
to get into the regular system in order to support learners where they are. And the Department of Basic Education is very strongly moving to where they see that the funding follows the learner rather than the learner following the funding. So that
Yeah.
there's an intention to move in that direction. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a real stumbling block
That's
for
that's
us.
really
Yeah.
That's really it's really interesting from an Irish perspective because we're at such a crossroads ourselves in our inclusive education policy. So, and I think funding is key and instrumental. But I'd love to
Mm.
move on now, Judy, to your own research, your the impact of your research over the last number of decades, and I see two main areas of focus that you've taken. And maybe we'd start with the first area, and it might bring us up to what's going on in South Africa today in terms of policy change. But inclusive education policy development and policy development more generally has been a focus for your work. Do you want to talk a little bit about that as a research area? And I suppose we are undertaking at the moment a comparative between Ireland and South Africa in terms of inclusive education policy. Maybe we could finish by talking about that particular project.
Right. So the policy development process in South Africa has been pretty consultative and inclusive, and I've had the privilege to be part of the different stages and to be able to contribute. And I think that we've done quite well in developing, but I think the fundamental issue that we're facing is that our guiding document has contradictions that keep on blocking our understanding and our progress at different points. So I think it's a real exciting possibility now that policy is under review to try and move out of that stalemate that is really preventing some of the really good initiatives from happening. So I think that's I think also the thing with policy is that, it's so clear that it can't be done in isolation. More and more, the more we work on it, the more we see that inclusive education policy on its own and in isolation is less likely to be effective. So I think it's a matter of working to the point where we would never need to have an inclusive education policy, where it would just be part of general policy. Um, I don't think that's. I think that's a bit dangerous at this stage. But I think that is, especially when we have a lot of education, low standards of education in the country anyway. So the efforts really need to be concentrated and need to all work together. So I think that that's been an interesting observation, is just seeing how it can't be done in isolation. How um, it needs to work for all children. So having had that experience, it's been really interesting now to be involved in this process, and I've really enjoyed being able to have these discussions with you in Ireland as to policy development stages. And I think one of the things that has really struck me in our collaboration, and when one thinks, well, what can be similar in such different contexts? We just need to look at the population size between our two different countries, and you're already thinking, well, what's the similarity? But I think the one thing that I've learned quite strongly is the strength of a special education discourse and how powerful it is, and how, but I don't know why. Actually, I don't know why. So hopefully we'll make some progress on that. But it is a very powerful discourse. And maybe one suspicion I have is that it is related to the way in which we see disability as being a static kind of thing that renders a person incapable for life, incompetent for life, not able to do certain things. And it's a static, seen as static, not something that changes with the environment. So I think that really brings me to understand the importance of bringing disability studies, because my discipline is actually disability studies. So it brings me to the importance of bringing disability studies strongly into the education arena, so that we can begin to understand disability as an environmental issue, depending on the extent to which the environment is adapted. And I think that's what inclusive education for me is about, is how our curriculum and classrooms adapted to meet the widest range of learning needs. So I think that's looking at the policy development, trying to bring those kind of ideas into policy.
Yeah. And can I ask, just, in terms of your role as an academic in a higher education institute, to what extent does the government interact, liaise, take advice, take expertise from academia? Is that an established pathway, or are you confident that the policy is adequately informed by research evidence, or the kind of broader theoretical frameworks, and disability studies being a perfect example of that? Is there familiarity with discourses like that?
I think that we are lucky to have a good relationships in our sector. I can't talk for other sectors, but certainly in the policy work I do, that we have a good relationship with government, that we have conversations, that we are able to share our work. But that's not the same thing as seeing it enacted in policy and actually seeing it come through in policy. So I think that whatever that relationship is like, there's still that gap between the evidence and the what is actually done in policy. And we had this discussion. That's politics, the politics of the time. So, one example is, we know that both in your country and in ours, sometimes it looks good to say we'll do a special school, we'll provide special services, and that becomes a political act, which might not really fit with the policy itself. So I think And sometimes that's even to the frustration of the administrators that we work with. They would also like to see it
Right.
go in different ways. But, you're subject to politics, you're subject to budgets and finance. But I think what is important, and I think what we're working towards, is that kind of feeling that we are looking at those problems together, that we're not on different sides of the fence, and that we understand that administrators are not just like ignoring us or like, but they have their own constraints, and we need to understand those constraints and to somehow be on the same side and looking at how together we can work around and through and with some of those constraints. I think that's what we're looking at. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, I suppose there's a number of stakeholders in the policy process, really, and I think we've probably identified this over the past while. But you mentioned politics, but in Ireland, parents and advocacy have a huge voice in terms of influencing that politics and influencing policy decision making. Um, what do parents and kind of civil society campaign for in South Africa? Is it for greater resources? Is it for greater special education, or is it for inclusive education with appropriate and adequate supports in
Well,
the
as I
mainstream?
mentioned earlier, Joan, I started working on inclusive education through advocacy parent groups. So, in fact, those groups led the campaign for inclusive education, families and parents, as I think happened in other countries as well. So, I think the push is largely from parents is in that direction. But I think that there's a lot of frustration from families and parents because they just feel that their children aren't getting what they need. So I think, that's the main thing, is inclusive, special, whatever it is, just look after my child, just give them a place where they can learn, where they can be safe, and where they can progress. And that is really, I think, a lot of parents are more interested in that than even necessarily the place of provision. One of the very sad issues around families is that we still have a lot of special schools that require hostels. And so there are many children that are sent away. Unfortunately, I don't know the numbers that are in school, special school hostels, but there are many children that are sent away to hostels, separated from their families. And we've had a couple of instances
Okay.
of really abusive situations occurring in those hostels. So there is another area where parents are
Right.
obviously extremely distressed and advocating for their children to just be safe rather than anything else.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
yeah, the
Yes.
families, I think, are entitled to and should have a greater voice in what is happening. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Judy, I might just move on to another area that, well, you have researched on and worked on for many years, and which we both have a shared interest in, which is, and it tends to come up in policy discussions around inclusive education as well, right? But it's initial teacher education and teacher education more generally, and the importance of that in the implementation of any inclusive
Yes,
system.
yeah, that is a really huge interest of mine. And I think that it sort of stems from, well, we know how critical teachers are in the process. But I think of the early days of inclusive education when it was certainly in our context, it was quite ideological. You must do it like this. It's the rights. And I feel that there was a lot of finger pointing at teachers that they weren't doing what they ought to do and that they should do more and so on. And then we had the opportunity to carry out a large teacher education project, Teacher Empowerment for Disability Inclusion, we called it, funded by the EU. And I think when the name of the project kind of says it all, Teacher Empowerment for Disability Inclusion, because there were a couple of things we learned about teacher education that I think are really valuable, and we have written a lot of this up, is first of all the empowerment that it's not it's not an end in itself. Becoming an inclusive teacher is not an outcome. It's a process that you carry on throughout the years, and it requires professional development ongoing. So I think that's the one thing. The other one is that I think it is really important for teachers to move through, I wouldn't call it an attitude change. It's more because it's more like being able to work with a different kind of discourse, a different understanding, and seeing themselves where they position themselves within that discourse with regard to disability. Um, so I think that's where the disability studies come in, and that's where I feel like a disability studies and education perspective is very useful with teachers, because they have to look at their own understanding, their own approaches and fears, their own, and in an environment that is safe in which to do that. So I think that's a really important thing that we found,
Yes.
and one of the ways to do that, and the last point on that that we really found important, is to ensure that we include people with disabilities and their families in all the education and all the teaching. To the extent that we've had teachers say to us, "But I didn't know that a blind person could have a PhD," or "I didn't know that that a person in a wheelchair could have children." So these kind of
Yeah.
misconceptions are
Yep.
exposed. So I think that, and I want to just stress, I'm talking about disability, and it may seem that that's my view of inclusive education, and I want to just stress that it's not, but it is. As much as we understand barriers to learning, as much as we understand inclusive education in the broad sense, there are areas of expertise within that. So, for example, migrant children, which is an issue in right across Africa, and of course more in Europe as well. Um, the that is a massive issue for inclusive education. I don't have the expertise in that, but others do, and they must also get that in there. So I think that's why I'm saying that these things are really important for disability inclusion, but that what other facets of inclusion that need to. I think that just one more thing I'd like to make on teacher education is I feel that I'm very keen on universal design for learning as a framework that teachers can work with on an ongoing basis to create learning environments that cater to diversity. Because and we have been criticized, and in the African context, people say, but it's too complex. It's requires too many resources. So I think we're very interested in seeing how is the framework used, because you don't have to use the UDL guidelines. You don't have to use the CAST guidelines. You can use the framework, and you can organize your learning around that framework without necessarily having to do each of those steps. So I think that's another area that we're looking at, and that we're hoping. So it's really the empowerment, the disability inclusion, and the UDL, I think, are the areas that we're very keen on in teacher education. In my research unit, which is
Yeah.
including disability and education in Africa, and we do run short training programs from there with that ethos. Yeah.
They, I was just about to ask, is there appetite? Do teachers uh, I was going to say exposure to UDL? Do they want CPD? Are they looking for further learning, especially the ones that have completed their initial teacher education? Is there appetite for UDL and other kind of inclusive framework
Well,
or other inclusive pedagogies?
yes, but I think it has to be promoted. I mean, I think that we've got 4 MOOCs on the Coursera platform on teaching children with disabilities, and if you look at the numbers, they are high. You get 25,000 on one course. Not all of them complete, and in fact, a very small number that complete the course. But they've been in there, they've had a look. Some of them have got something, some of them have got nothing. But they're certainly visited a lot, and there are people that are interested. We've done a couple of research, small scale, very small scale, and I'd love to be able to do this on a larger scale. We've done some small research projects on the response of teachers to online learning. And it's been very positive, mainly in the sense that they can tailor it to their own needs. They can do it when they want. And I think there is appetite. But it goes with the empowerment idea. As long as teachers are just sitting there waiting for the department or whoever it is to come and train them, then they are less likely to go out and find these programs. So I think it's really it has
Yeah.
to do a lot with me about professional development, about possibly incentives. But I think being a good professional is an incentive in itself. And I think that's the incentive that we're trying to work
Yeah.
with rather than uh, financial or professional diplomas or degrees as well. Yeah.
Judy, we've covered quite a lot in a very short period of time, but is there anything that you'd like to raise that we haven't covered or that you think is important for listeners to know? Or you mentioned there what you'd like to see more research on. Sometimes people like to finish up with where they think there's a gap in the research that they think might be really, really helpful. But is there anything you'd like to add that
Well,
we
I
haven't
think,
covered?
yeah, Jan, just to say that my other real area of interest is around intellectual disability and that really across the lifespan. So that isn't just an inclusive education issue, but across the lifespan, I'm interested. But being interested across the lifespan has led to a reflection on the curriculum. When we look at the curricula that students with intellectual disability are exposed to, they don't really, there's a gap in terms of how they prepare those students for the world of work, for transition to adult life. Um, and to me, that's a very important gap. And I think a lot of it has to do with curriculum and what they actually are doing in schools, because it's common in many countries that where there is provision made for students with intellectual disability, when they finish that form of schooling, there really isn't anything left. And I think that's where Trinity has been so forward thinking in the development of third level programs. Now, obviously, that's not feasible in a lot of other contexts. I wouldn't say it's feasible in ours at this stage. But transition programming and developing curricula that lead into transition, that connect the student with intellectual disability to work and to occupation, I think is something I'm really interested in and hoping to do more on over the next while.
Yeah, and it goes back to your, I suppose, the idea of UDL as well, in terms of the capacity of UDL to counter the kind of one size fits all curriculum that many systems have. But how important do you think it is to have like a tailored curriculum for students with intellectual disabilities, or a kind of a combined curriculum where students can opt for different kind of levels, if you like, as they progress through second level? And as you said, that kind of unmet area of the kind of post school pathways and that transition into
I
education or
think
work.
the more I work with it, I think it's our expectations that need to be changed. The curricula that we offer are within a narrow band of expectations of what these students are able to do and to achieve. And I always like the
Yeah.
uh, Christopher Cleaver and Douglas Bicklin always talk about the um, presuming competence and how we don't do that. We presume incompetence. And if we can move towards presuming competence, I think we'll have a very different looking curriculum than if we are presuming incompetence and teaching to the incompetence all the time. So I think that's we need to open it out. It's been very restrictive, and we need to open it out and give and uh, work on our own expectations. What are we actually expecting? What is the other phrase that comes to mind is the least damaging assumption. Um, uh, so to make your assumptions around just check your assumptions and the damage that they do before you
Mm.
act on those assumptions. And I think that people with intellectual disability have been so much subject, and I see that with my own son now as well. The expectations that
Mm.
people have around him are low, and he fulfills them. And if they were higher, I think you would
Yes.
fulfill them too.
Yes.
So I think we've made a big mistake there in terms of our
Yeah.
expectations. And I think that's whether it's this different curriculum or the same curriculum, whatever it is, I think it needs to be more open, and it needs to be founded on presuming competence rather than presuming incompetence, which we do for our regular students. We
Yeah, that's a
presume
really,
that they will be able to do it. Yeah, yeah,
of
yeah,
course.
yeah.
Yes. A couple of times I think, well, a lot of what you've said here this morning has gone back to it's beyond the education system, and it's culture and attitudes in our society more generally, right? And I can't help thinking that history is guiding a lot of the present day culture and attitudes that you're describing. It certainly applies here in Ireland as well, just as to how we have traditionally treated, viewed, or had expectations of certain cohorts in the population, such as students with intellectual disabilities. So I think that's really interesting. Judy, thanks so much. I really enjoyed that. I'm going to add in the show notes anything you've referred to in the podcast. I'm going to add and give links so that listeners can click in and see all the work that you cited here this morning. But just want to say thanks, and it's been a real pleasure
Thank
chatting
you,
with you.
Jan. Thanks very much. I hope it's not too much of a ramble and has some value for other people as well. Thank you.